Welcome to the Father on Purpose podcast, featuring author and ministry leader Kent Evans and business executive and military veteran Lawson Brown. This is a show for you, Dad. You want to be a godly and intentional father. Unfortunately, you've turned to these two knuckleheads for help. Let us know how that works out for you. Before we begin, remember this: you are not a father on accident. So go be a father on purpose. Please welcome your hosts, Kent and Lawson.
Hey, Dad, today, Lawson and I have a special guest with us. He is a new friend of mine. His name is Don Manning, and Don leads the ministry called Crazy Cool Family. We're going to talk about Don's ministry. We're going to talk about his book. We're going to talk about his own family with 7 kids of his own. And we hope today's show will be a huge blessing to you. Don, thanks for joining us on the show today, brother. We're really excited to have you.
Oh, man, Kent, honored to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You bet. Let me start with just a brief kind of history lesson for the guys dialing in. Don and I met 6 or so months ago. We were both shooting some videos for a mutual friend in the ministry space in Nashville, Tennessee. Got to know each other a little bit, then happened to be together a month or so ago at a pastor's conference and went out to a really fun dinner with our friends at Better Man. Had a great couple interactions with you, Don, and have really appreciated your heart for families, your heart for moms and dads and raising kids. Tell us a little bit about your family and give us kind of the Don Manning sort of 411.
Yeah, so born and raised in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, lived here all my life. So been at the same church for over 30 years. My wife and I helped start. We've never been on staff, so I'm a businessman. I'm a CPA, actually. I'm probably one of the world's worst CPAs because I want to teach men. I'm more about ministry and life, and that's a whole nother story. But I'm trained as a CPA. I'm been in the real estate business for 20 years. So, just a businessman from that standpoint, from a career perspective. Been in worked locally in the Dallas-Fort Worth area my whole life, and then. Many years ago, we got involved when we first started getting involved with the church, and we were open to having a larger family. Obviously, we got a lot of kids, and we just started doing life with our church. I've been very blessed to be a part of a local church. I tell men all the time, man, get involved in the local church. Find a great church and get involved because it's had a huge blessing in my life, and stay with it. I was talking to a guy from Africa just yesterday, and he says, when I go to America, he said, people leave churches for reasons that we wouldn't do in Africa, because they have a more of a familial, however that word is, the family culture. And I said, and we just said, he goes, it's unusual. You guys are at your same church for 20 and 30 years. And we said, you know what, that's right. You're exactly right. And so, because people, bounce churches for many different reasons, but we were at the same church for many, many years. And, while we were there, we were getting discipled well, but we weren't getting really, family, a lot of family teaching, which is typical of churches. And so my wife and I were just started to do a lot of homework, and we're raising our 7 kids, and we started to really appreciate the need for learning how to be great parents. And that led us on this journey. Started just with our church. We when you have 7 kids and those kids love the Lord, people start asking you the same questions you're asking other parents of, hey, what are you guys doing? Led to us teaching our parents at our church, which led to us writing a book and on and on. And now we have 7 kids, and they're 34 to 18. We have 8 grandkids. We have, 5 of them, or 5 of the, not the grandkids, 5 of the kids are married. And we're just doing life, and God's really blessed us with a family that we love. I tell parents, dads all the time that, when God shows you how to do family right, family is the easiest thing I do every day because the relationships are good, the connections are good. And it's like Jesus talks about that my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's what happens. That's why he can say that when we live the Christian life and we can have that blessing of family. And so we try to pass that along to everybody we can.
Hey, Don,
I just did about 30 years in about 3 minutes. So I left it out, but there you go.
That's a good background. It's good to finally meet you. Wow. 7 children and a business person out in the world doing things. starting a church, creating a ministry. That's fantastic. Tell me, I'm always curious of the origin story, like how did Crazy Cool Family become like your idea, and then getting it
Yeah.
going. Like, I understand the mission. I've seen your all's stuff, and the fact that you and your wife are doing this together is just great. But talk about what God put on your heart to begin,
Yeah.
and maybe weave in kind of how did you navigate doing all that. We talk on the podcast sometimes about how important it is for dads to carve out time and to be purposeful in how they manage their family relationships and the time that takes. So you guys have done a lot. Tell the origin story, but weave in kind of like, how do you balance all that and
Yeah,
make sure
that's a
that you
great.
have the time?
Well, I think the first thing, there was look at about year 8 of my marriage parenting journey. So when I was married, I was automatically a dad. My wife brought a 2-year-old to the marriage. My oldest daughter's 2, and then we've had 6 together. So I was an instant dad, but and also I have 4 girls and 3 boys. So at one time, picture this, man, it was me and 5 women in my house. I mean, it was, I mean,
Mhm.
and honestly, it brought me to a crisis of belief because
Mm.
I was clueless. I didn't know. I mean, I was trying hard to be a great dad, and it seemed like the more I got onto them, the further they were drifting away from me, and it was just so confusing about what to do. In the
Mhm.
meantime, I'm a CPA. I mean, I started out my career working for Ernst and Young, wanted to be a high top leader. But I'm also going through this relationship with God thing, and I'm being discipled in my church. I'm being opened up to grace and God's love in a new way. So all this is kind of going on simultaneously, and it leads me to one day I'm just sitting in my study, and I don't know. I want to know where I'm going to make my mark in the world. And I'm asking God that, okay, God, where are we going? Let's, show me where to go. And, is it going to be business? Is it going to be ministry? Is it going to be, I even thought about politics and running for school board and where was I going to achieve basically? And I never will forget this moment because I feel like the Lord said to me, I'm not in any of that.
Mm. Nice.
And I said, well, that's great. I'm kind of mad about it really because I'm frustrated with, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe you can
None of it?
show me
None
where
of it?
we are going. Maybe you can give me some insight and influence. And it was one of the first times I ever heard the Lord really speak to me deeply. And he said, here's what I want you to do, Don. I want you to do 2 things. I want you to go deep with me, and I want you to go deep with your family. And I want you to watch what I'm going to produce. And one day you're going to tell people about it.
Nice.
And I said, I didn't say nice, Kent. I said, oh my goodness, really? I'm going to play Barbies. That's what I'm going to do. I don't get to go conquer the world. I'm going to go play Dollhouse and hear about, 10 kids and what their names are. I said, it wasn't appealing to me, but it was one of the first times I felt God, felt the Lord say, hey, will you obey me?
Mm.
And I said, okay. So, at that point, I changed to where I decided to put my career in a certain box. It wasn't it wasn't like the career wasn't important, but I decided that I was going to make my family more of a priority. I was going to be, and therefore with my certain jobs, I didn't, like, for example, I wouldn't take a job that traveled. Not that other guys can't do that. It's just for me, that was where had a lot of kids. Eventually, my career went back locally. It went from Dallas to Denton, which is a smaller, with a community job, community career, if you will. Those are some things that happened. And I got super involved in my family. Well, that was the birth. And so then I just spent, 10 or 15 years just doing family, doing church, doing life. Does that make sense?
Yeah, man, a lot. And one of the things I wanted to draw the dad's attention to, Don, is your book called Crazy Cool Family. And this is a slight shift in the conversation, but I want to ask you about a specific thing in the book. In chapter 7, you talk about prayer. And one of the comments you make in the book is that crazy cool parents understand their best chance to lead their children to the Lord is through fervent and consistent prayer. And it sounds like part of what you were doing in that process with God is you were having this conversation back and forth with God about what he wanted you to focus on, where he wanted you to aim your attention. Talk a little bit more about, a dad listening who wants, we get a lot of hits on our blog. We get a lot of downloads of our reading plan on prayer. So
Right.
we know dads care a lot about it, but a lot of them say they're not sure how to do it, where to begin, whether to talk or listen. Talk a little bit about the role prayer has played in your life as a parent.
Yeah. And,
Hey, real quick, Don, I
yeah.
was actually with someone weekend before last. We were talking about prayer, and I talked about praying with my kids or with my family.
Mm,
And this guy specifically said, "Oh my gosh, I get so nervous."
mm,
So keep that guy in mind, because I think there's more of them out there that feel like I did early on too. Is like, man, I got to get this prayer right. I got to
Yeah.
sound,
yeah,
like
that's
you know
right.
what I mean.
Well, and just even hear what I was saying to God there. I've had the blessing of having people, really challenge me that God's my friend. He's my, and so I am mad at God when he says that. I don't want that. So often when I hear God speak, and it isn't an audible voice, I've never heard, and I don't even know that I'm a great prayer. I've never thought that I'm not one of these guys that spends 6 hours in prayer every day and just has this super intimate, I don't,
Yeah.
it's always been a little bit hard for me to, but I do think one of the things that God's blessed me with is that I am willing to listen and I'm willing to battle. And so that's one of the things
Mm,
that I think is out there and I just feel like that, God, I picture God as being, in fact, one of my great pictures of God is that, I'm a granddad now. Pops is what they call me. And, most of them can't talk yet, but the ones that can call me Pops. But and God gave me a picture the other day of just, how when I all walk down with my grandson, he's 5 and we're just walking down the concrete driveway and he's holding my hand looking up to me like, hey dad, that's my picture of praying to God, that I'm like, Jesus says we're sheep and he's the shepherd, that we are the children of God, thinking about just holding God's hand because and really compared to God, I am a 5-year-old, I'm a 3-year-old, I may be,
Mhm.
I'm not very smart, but just thinking about, how he talks to me is how I can talk to God. And how, if I can, hopefully, if he's teachable, my 5-year-old grandson, I can teach him some things about how to do life. And that's what God wants to do with me. I don't know if that answers your question, Kent, but it really is. And it really is just an interaction. I think that there's so many ways God speaks to us, but, in also just through other people and things like that. But it was there, and I think there's times that God just, not every day has God given me that kind of revelation.
mm,
There are times that there's markers where God, if you look through the Old Testament, there's times when God said, hey, Abraham, we're going to go this way. And then that's what Abraham did for a long time. And that's what kind of happened to me is God set me a direction. Well, then it was just a matter of fulfilling that direction for many, many
mm,
years to
yeah.
come. Does that make sense?
Well, and for the
Mhm.
guy who's back at kind of the batter's box, he's thinking, man, I really have never been um very active prayer, either myself or with my wife or for my family or with my family. What are one or two things you would say to that guy that would be kind of like the beginning steps? Not the,
Yeah.
not the hit and run, the pick and roll, the sophisticated plays. What are the things you would say to that guy? You'd say, hey man, if you're kind of stuck on prayer, start here.
Well, that's great. And I will also say that, I'm a guy that I've always struggled. My wife and I have never had a really great prayer life together. We have a great, we have a much better relationship. Our marriage is a whole nother story, but I mean, it's a relationally, we're good, but we just have never conquered the prayer together thing. So I just want to give hope to guys and say, man, we all have issues. Okay. We all have issues, but God's bigger than that. But to answer your question, I just think I love, for example, praying scripture. I
Mm,
think that's a great way to get started. I was reading this morning Psalm 127, and it just and I was in our church this summer. We're going through Psalm 127 and Psalm 103, kind of memorizing that and meditating on that. And, so I was just, in Psalm 103 is like, bless the Lord, oh my soul, with all that is within me, bless his holy name. Okay, that's a prayer. And so we can just really start with God's word, maybe even personalizing scripture. If I'm reading something and it says you, I say I, Lord, I want to bless you, Lord, but I bless you, Lord, oh my soul. And it just starts a dialogue. So just making it simple, telling the, 1 Peter, I think 5:7 says, cast your cares upon him because he cares about you. So, John Eldredge just says, and John Eldredge has an app, it's called Pause. And he says, do that when you start out with your prayer. Just cast your cares upon the Lord. Start out with, Lord, man, here's what I'm frustrated with. Here's what I'm doing. So just simple things like that can help a guy get started with prayer.
Yeah. And being real, just be yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don, I believe that there is a movement happening with men, with dads, compared to 20, 30 years ago. What are you finding, and what are you hearing from guys that you talk to?
Yeah, I that to me, like, for example, you're talking about hearing God's voice. What you're just saying there to me is a word of the Lord for me. It resonates with me. It resonates with my heart. So God is speaking to me through you right there and confirming some things in my heart. You're in Florida, I'm in Texas, but it's happening. So God speaks in so many different ways, I think. But to answer your question is, I totally agree. I kind of alluded to it a little while. No, I'm sorry, you were talking, this was pre-podcast, Kent, sorry. But I was talking about how I feel like there is this movement that years ago, we thought as men, our job was to make the money and to be hard on our kids. If you look at our dads and we were supposed to be firm with them, and we needed to, make sure they we got on to them when they did. And actually, that's how I started my parenting career. If my kids did something wrong, I needed to tell them about it. And if they did it wrong again, they needed to hear it again, because my job was to make them obey, to have good behavior. I had the best intentions. But I think what's happening now is that men are seeing, I ask men two questions. I say, do you want to connect with your child? And do you want to have a great relationship with your child? You know what? Almost every man I talk to today says yes. I want to have a relationship. I want to be a good dad. I want to be their hero. I want to be involved in their lives. And then I say, well, how's that going? And there's crickets. Because they're confused, just like I was when I had 4 girls, and I was like, I don't have a clue how to reach their heart, and so I feel like there's this desire, but they feel a little bit lost, and they don't know how to get there. And so I don't know, is that kind of what you guys are seeing too?
What's going on, dads? Check this out. Hey, in the world of fatherhood, balancing style and functionality is key, right? Range Leather gets it. Offering products like the sleek Elbert wallet and the American flag hat. It's perfect for dads on the move. Made from the finest Horween leather, Range's products don't just look good. They are built to accompany you through every dad duty with elegance and resilience. Snag your next dad essential at rangeleather.com and save 15% when you use code MJ15 at checkout. Head to rangeleather.com to get your swag. That's RANGE leather.com.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about trends is that we live them during our lifetime. And so I find guys who occasionally get to their 40s or 50s and go, oh, you know what? It's all that rock and roll music. And so what happens is we tend to map what we can see from the time we're born till the time we die. And we think all this stuff is happening in our lifetime. And so sometimes I question our observances of trends, because it might have to do with my own personal maturity, right? I'm probably dialing into things in my mid 50s that were always there. But I wasn't dialing into in my 30s. For sure. I think what we're at least seeing from my chair is in a fatherhood ministry is we're seeing, I got an email last week from a guy in South Africa. I got an email a couple days ago from a guy in Minnesota. And that's all anecdotal. It's very small data points, but I see more and more, even if you track our input over the last year, the input from our audience has gone way up in terms of their feedback, their interest level, their desire to get it, do it right and pursue godliness and all that. I'm also seeing super high pressure in terms of mental health and finances and things like that. And I want to ask you about that, Don. I think that one thing I don't want a dad to hear is that if he is just a perfect dad, his family will be perfect. Like if he just does everything right, Christmases are going to be great, because that's not biblical and that's not actually totally true, right? I know I'm thinking of a dad right now who had two daughters. One was fairly like almost angelic in her sort of just maturity curve. She was easy to parent. She stuck around, loved her family. And one was the exact opposite. Deep depression, deep oppression, tons of challenges in their family. And what I don't want that dad to hear is, hey, if you just follow the crazy cool family method and you do what Don did, your kids are all just going to be super happy go lucky. Talk to that dad a little bit who probably has been pursuing godliness. He is pursuing a strong marriage. He is pursuing a relationship with his children, but things just don't seem to be clicking. It reminds me of the story Jesus told of the prodigal son. It wasn't the dad's fault the kid decided to run off. Talk to that dad, because I hear from those dads a lot in my email inbox who are expressing a heartfelt desire to do it right, but just don't quite yet see the results.
Right. And I think that's a great point. And I want to talk about the other side too, because you also get some people who say, well, it doesn't matter you never know how they're going to turn out. And that's a statement I really I'm not very fond of, because I believe that God has given us direction and ways to help minimize the chances of that dad having the depressed kid or whatever. But I do think that it really comes down to, what I find is that it's not about whether we think about outcomes being the point. Is our child perfect? Is our child obedient? Is our child performing well? Whatever that is. I don't look at that as the value that I'm pursuing as a dad. And what I learned more than anything over 30 years of parenting, and what really changed me more than anything, is that Jesus is about connection, not control and performance. So let's say that dad does have that issue. So I'll say two things about it. One of them is usually when I talk to dads, I'm like, let's get focused on connection, because that's going to help you. Most of your issues are going to be, especially when a dad connects, you're going to get a lot. It's going to help you with a lot of those issues. But let's go back to that dad where you're talking about that kind of example of one great kid and one depressed kid. Okay. Both girls, whatever. The goal of the dad is not to make the depressed kid into a high performing kid like the other kid and, to do all the right things. The goal of the dad is the same, is to connect with that kid. The goal of the dad is to be vulnerable with that kid. The goal of the dad is to, because God's got them on a journey, and what the dad tries to do is, I've got to fix this kid. I've got, and because I've got my own issues, and because my kid has issues, somehow we failed. You know what? If you look at how Jesus interacted with his disciples, he didn't interact with them like that. When Peter denied him on the, at the cross, or, when Jesus was taken away, Jesus went back and restored Peter. And so what I would say to that dad is, okay, you can't change the past, but what are you going to do to connect with your daughters and connect with God for the future? Because that's the pathway to success. That's the pathway to everything God has for you, is connection.
We had an episode recently about trusting God, and was also talking with a friend of mine who's been a pastor for a long time. He and I have known each other a couple decades. And I asked him about the degree to which you try to hold on to your kids and control the environment and control your children, and versus releasing and letting go and trusting God with your kids. And he laughed. He said, it's real easy, Lawson, for me to trust God with your kids. It's really hard for me to trust God with my own kids. What do you say to a guy that's struggling with that, Don?
Well, it's just like, for example, someone taught me many years ago the power of forgiveness. And they taught me that Jesus says that no matter what somebody does to me, I don't have to forget it, but I do forgive. And how many times do I forgive? Well, 70 times 7 or whatever that number is in that passage, but it's just over and over and over again. And the standard is we forgive all the time. Okay. So the standard for what God wants us to do is to totally trust him with our kids. I mean, it's all about God. And in fact, that very trust, in fact, that was the biggest, I would say the two biggest things I've ever learned as a parent is that, one, I need to trust my kids. I need to entrust my kids to God and to believe that he has their best interest at heart. And that actually my trust, it facilitates the very thing, my lack of trust actually facilitates, it brings about the outcome that I don't want. Does that make sense? The more I trust, Jesus says, have faith, increase your faith. There's so many things about faith. When faith wasn't there, he couldn't do miracles. You want God to do a miracle with your kids, trust him with them. It's a belief system. And the second thing I learned is to be inspiring and encouraging rather than critical. When we have faith, we become inspiring. Jesus, we call out who they are rather than tell them who they're not. Okay. So trust is this motor that then creates an inspiring, engaging dad that says, okay, can I tell you a quick story to illustrate? My oldest son, he's 23 now. He said, Dad, do you remember when I coached you, when you coached me in basketball, when I was like, okay, where are you going with this? He goes, well, do you remember when I would go out there, you would, maybe I wasn't doing what you wanted me to do to take the ball to the basket. And you would tell me, Michael, that guy can't hold you. That guy cannot cover you. Take the ball to the basket. And instead of telling me what I was doing wrong, he said, you told me what I could do. You told me who I was going to be. And then he said, I don't even know if you believed it. And I don't know if it was true. He said, when I walked out on that court, I thought of myself differently and I thought of my opponent differently. And I took the ball to the basket. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that if you trust God with your kids, then it inspires you to act differently, which brings about the very thing you're trusting to happen.
That's a good word, man. We got to speak life into our kids, man. We got to obviously do some corrective action over time, but we run the risk of only doing that and never speaking life into our kids. Don, there's one more thing I would love for you to touch on, and I want to encourage our listener to go to crazycoolfamily.com. Go check out the book, Crazy Cool Family, Rethink the Way You Do Family by Don and Suzanne Manning. Thank you for this resource. I enjoyed reading it. There's one comment in the resource I wanted you to just pull out and talk about, because I know dads wrestle with this a lot. And I know it's a weak spot for dads because they tell us it's a weak spot for them. You say, if you listen to them when they're 5, they'll talk to you when they are 15. And just talk a little bit about.
That's a Suzanne quote, by the way. That's my wife. I have to attribute that to the author.
Sure. Just talk about the power of listening as a dad, wherever you want to take that. And then we'll wrap up with one final word from you. But tell us about the power of listening.
So we talk a lot at Crazy Cool Family. And when you look at our book, and I'm going to introduce you to another resource at the end to challenge you at the end, Dad. So stay with us. But we talk about 2 words, relationships and culture. That the 2 things, we've talked a lot already in this podcast about connection, and I've alluded to culture. But when you're a dad in the home, both mom and dad, but you want to build a culture. your build, just, if you think about it from a business standpoint, think about your business culture. Do you like where your culture is? What's the feel of your business? What's the feel of your home? Many homes are very critical in nature, and the parents are overbearing with great intentions. Don't get me wrong. I have to change the way a lot of parents believe in terms of how you create the culture in your home. And I alluded, there's two things. There's several elements of culture, but two of them we're going to get to that involve listening. The first one I said was to be an inspiring parent instead of a critical one. We call that at Crazy Cool Family, encourage extravagantly and correct carefully. So that's the speaking part. So how you speak into them is very important. Speaking life, what you just said, Kent. We want to be more speaking life and less speaking death, if you will. Secondly, we talk about creating a safe haven in your home. Okay. Safety, not physically, physical safety is important, but safe emotionally and relationally, so that James 1 says that we are quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Okay. That's the price of admission right there. I mean, if you can do those three things with your kids, if you can be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry. So if that is a belief system that you have, you guys were talking just a little while ago about the lack of trust, hard to trust. We got to believe that listening first is the key. It doesn't mean, and here's dads, this is so critical. You always have the discipline hammer in your pocket. You can always pull it out. You're just not pulling it out yet until you understand more what's going on with your child. The trouble is you got a dad who got this hammer and he's just banging it everywhere. First thing he does, as soon as he hears something, he's just banging that hammer all over the place, and he does damage, versus having a carpenter who takes that hammer and he waits and he puts the nail in the right spot, and boom, he hits it one time and it's done, maybe twice. Okay, that's what listening does to you. And what a dad thinks usually is, oh, I don't have time to listen. I know what they're going to say. I just need to solve the problem. And it's like, what I got to convince that dad of, and I had to be convinced of, is that when I listen, I'm going to be a better parent. I'm going to make better decisions. I'm going to speak better. I'm going to have more influence. And now it's like, it's hard to get me to give advice to my kids because they have to pull it out of me, because I so want to understand. And okay, one other thing, and we teach all this in all that we do, but is that when you listen well and when you ask questions well, you learn how to make it their idea what you want them to do.
Right.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
Yeah. And so what happens is that, so many times when I ask questions, well, what do you think about that? Well, how did you, what do you think would be your next step? Well, I need to ask forgiveness of them. Oh my goodness, really? Amazing. That's an amazing idea. I just think that's the voice of the Lord. Why don't you go do that? And what my wife said, last thing I'll say about this is that if you can picture us, so many times as parents, we're on one side and the parent and the kid is on the other. And we are talking to them. We are talking over them, if you will. Right. And if you can picture, I have to do a mental, a non-showing picture here. But when your kid, you picture God is behind the parent, and literally the kid can't see God because the parent's in the way. And the parents talking and they're doing all this stuff and they're yelling and they're lecturing and they're doing all this stuff. Well, when you ask questions and you listen, picture yourself coming alongside your kid on the other side where you're with them. And now both of you can see God together. And now you can see you're going to help your child discern the voice of the Lord and follow in the right path. So so more about that. We go, that's why in our ministry, we go really deep with how to be an encouraging, inspiring parent and how to be a listening parent, because those are two superpowers that help you be a more influential dad.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. Perfect.
Don, a final word from you. You alluded to a resource you wanted to bring up. Please do that. And we are super grateful as you wrap us up today for your time and for your investment in families and dads. Dad, go check out the book, Crazy Cool Family. and check out the website, crazycoolfamily.com. Don, a final word over to you.
Yeah. So for your dads, we came out this year with two guides, two 6-session guides. And, years ago when and Crazy Cool Family was the attempt at that, but I just said, I want to write dads a playbook. I want to write dads that if you'll focus on these things with listening and encouragement, just a couple of those things, if you'll focus on the connection, I want to give you a playbook, if you will, for how to do family, and something that you can talk about with your wife and share with your wife. And so what we did, we've always been working on our content and how to deliver it better. This year we came out with 2 guides, and they're 2 6-session guides. They can actually be done simultaneously together, but for your listeners, it'll be in the show notes. And when you go to crazycoolfamily.com/special-offer, and you can purchase those guides. And actually, when this comes out, I'm going to get, there will be an email if you purchase it through that guide, you can go through these in either 6 weeks or 12 weeks, however long it takes, but they really are this playbook. It takes our book to a whole new level. It's interactive. You can journal it. You can talk about it with your wife. I would actually recommend getting a pair of guides for both of you to go through, because you can journal in them and things like that. But what I really want to challenge men to do is to get serious about learning about family.
And Don, thank you. And as we know, Dad, the fact that you're listening to this podcast probably means you are serious about wanting to be a more godly dad. So we're glad to have you along for the ride. And we have had a blast talking with Don Manning today from Crazy Cool Family. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Hey, Dad, thank you for listening to today's show. If you found this episode helpful, remember, you can get all the content and show notes at manhoodjourney.org/podcast. And if you really liked it, please consider doing 3 things. Number 1, share this podcast with someone. You can hit the share button in your app, wherever you listen to podcasts, or just call a person up and tell them to listen in. Number 2, subscribe to this podcast so you get episodes automatically. That helps us as well to help dads find the show. You can do that through your favorite listening app, whatever that is. And finally, review this podcast. Leave us a review, good or bad, wherever you listen. Those reviews also help other dads find the show. You can always learn more about what we're up to at manhoodjourney.org or fatheronpurpose.org. We will see you next week.